From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, a senior official in Donald Trump's administration has told LBC he's confident that Russia will agree to a peace deal in Ukraine. Sebastian Gorka, a deputy assistant to the US president, says the extent of Russian losses during its invasion makes continuing the war politically difficult. He also says Donald Trump's the only one who can bring it to an end.
There is no leader in the world today, not a nation head, not a prime minister, not a president who can bring peace to Ukraine and to the European continent except President Trump. And I think that has been realized by Kiev as it has also by Moscow.
Donald Trump's promised to impose counter tariffs on the EU after bringing in 25% taxes on steel and aluminium imports. The UK has been hit by the changes, with Sir Keir Starmer saying all options are on the table. A 20-year-old man from Cardiff's become the sixth person to be arrested after the death of a 40-year-old woman who was shot dead in South Wales. Joanne Penny died in Talbot Green on Sunday. Former Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says she feels a sense of relief after announcing her decision to step down from politics. The ex-SNP leader's told her constituents she's not going to stand for re-election. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 44 points at 85.40. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.18. LBC weather, largely cloudy with showers along the North Sea coast tonight and a low of -3. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
It's 1 minute past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. We have with us three regular panellists and one debutant. Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, author and political commentator. Lord Karan Bilimoria, crossbench peer, who's the founder of Cobra Beer, former president of the CBI, and he's got a new appointment. He chairs the International Chamber of Commerce UK. That sounds very grand. We'll find out more about that a bit later. Luke Charters is a newly elected Labour MP for York Outer. Is there a York Inner?
It's York Central in.
York Central. You see, that doesn't work, does it? It should be York Inner. Henry Hill is Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. They're here to take your calls, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number. You can text 84850. And, of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, an email question here from Neil in Glasgow, who says, the Prime Minister's response to Sir Ed Davies' question about visiting Canada to show UK support against USA aggression was, I've made a few phone calls. Do you think the disgraceful lack of visual and verbal support from the UK government in not wanting to upset Trump will damage Canadians' views of the UK, damage the Commonwealth, and damage the standing of the King as Canadian head of state? Henry Hill.
Potentially. I mean, I think the challenge when you're dealing with Trump is, of course, that we've seen with Zelensky that he really just, it's like having Emperor Caligula on the throne. You need to be there kissing the ring, making him feel like the biggest man in the room. And practically, that's the only way to get anything out of him. So if your goal is actually to, say, change American policy towards Canada, being performatively rude to Donald Trump would play very well at home with, I think, pretty much everyone, but is not the way to go about doing it. I think it does put the King in an extremely difficult position because, of course, he is the King of Canada as well. But the thing about that is Trump loves the monarchy. He absolutely, the razzle-dazzle of the monarchy, he absolutely loves it. So, frankly, I think that by now he should have received an invitation to a royal ball in Canada where the King could just put a word in his ear about maybe being nicer to his subjects.
Well, that would be an innovative thing to do. Yasmin.
No, I think you're right. He loves the trappings of palaces and crowns and all of that. But I don't think you placate such a bully, a political vandal and bully, by just kissing his ring. It's happening too much. People who should know better. Bullies just carry on bullying you, actually. And it is important to stand by Canada. They've got a new leader. A very competent man who will be good for the country, and we are allies. And I do worry about Keir Starmer's inability. It's a difficult one. I'm not having to do it, which is both not getting the furies up.
I'd love to see you in a room with Donald Trump.
Oh, I would love to be there. I would not be kissing his ring, but to play, not to play statesman or to to kiss his ring, but to be very kind of practical about it. Not to offend him, but then he'd be offended by anything. I do think we have to stand up to him. And I think Europe, the rest of Europe is doing that. And I'm very pleased that we're kind of more allied in that direction. But how much more do we bow to this man? He's ruining the world.
Well, when we've got our own industrial base back and, defence spending has been at 4% of GDP for about 10 years and we can
there
otherwise...
are other countries
we're outside...
and Europe is coming together on this. And I think our destiny lies more in that direction, frankly.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that Keir Starmer has somehow emerged as the European leader in this. I mean, he seems to have eclipsed Emmanuel Macron, which is quite an achievement.
Well, Macron's not very good anyway, but I don't think... one of the things about Britain is they always like to big up our influence. Actually, Europe has a very good stable of good leaders, and they're as shocked as everybody else about what he's doing.
So you don't like Macron, so you don't regard him as a good leader?
I don't think one should think... I think
you don't like Maloney.
No, I'm saying that collectively, the collective EU... The EU collective is a strong collective, and I think we should be more a part of it. I'm not saying we're going to go back into the EU, but I don't think this kowtowing to Trump is going to be good for anybody.
Luke Charters.
Well, I don't think it's worth getting in a tit-for-tat trade war with the US. That's not going to serve this country well, and I think it will be a great moment for Britain if we did get a US trade deal. I don't think we've got to pick sides in all of this. I think Keir Starmer has stepped up in the Oval Office. I felt quite proud to be British, and actually I've been sat in the House of Commons chamber seeing praise from both sides for how well he's been doing. But I don't think it's about picking sides. I think it's about staying cool, level-headed, rising above that in the national interest. So,
but you will appreciate that sort of looking at it from the point of view of a broadcaster and a commentator, it is quite amusing to see the lengths that Labour MPs go to not to criticise Donald Trump in the way that they did before he was elected.
Well, how's it going to do any good to my constituents?
I'm not saying it would, but you accept that it's slightly odd.
It's not going to do my constituents in York Outer any good, is it, to give a running commentary on everything that the US president says? I think we've got enough on our plate here in the UK.
OK. Lord Bilimoria.
From a business point of view, when whatever one may think of President Trump, we thought he'd be good for business in terms of lowering taxes. And initially, the American stock market reacted very positively. But what he's been doing with tariffs and the tariff wars that he's creating, including and in particular with his immediate neighbors, Mexico and Canada, I mean, people don't realize... People used to joke about Canada being the 51st state of the United States of America. No one's serious about that, because Canada is a serious country. And now they've got a serious Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who I worked closely with when I was president of the CBI, as governor of the Bank of England. And the amount of trade between Canada and the United States, it's one of the longest open borders. $3 billion per day goes up. And then if you're going to put tariffs on that... I mean, the worst thing about trade wars, and this is history repeating itself, go back to almost 100 years ago. What happened with the trade wars then and the tariff wars? It was a disaster. And the irony of it all is it comes back to bite the country that starts it the most. So the people who are going to suffer the most from this are the American consumers themselves.
And they already are, because prices are rising.
The stock market's crashing, prices will go up. And worst thing about it is when you have protectionism around the world, it actually erodes competitiveness. Because at the moment, with an open trading world, with a rules-based order, countries compete with each other. You have higher quality of products, more competitive prices around the world. The moment you start these tariff wars, that goes for a 6. So everyone suffers. No one's a winner from this. And the business community, the stock market is saying to President Trump, this is not a joke about the 51st state. Where Greenland is concerned, this is not a joke. They've just got a new government. So Europe as well, we've got to work with the United States. We respect the United States. By the way, never underestimate the power of the United States. 350 million people. The European Union plus the UK make up 500 million people. The economy of the United States of America is bigger than the whole of the EU and the UK put together. That's how powerful that country is. So they've got to be our friend. That must not change.
Anybody want to continue, or should we go into another question?
At what point do you say you can't behave like this with us? How far do we go along this line in the name of the trade which you very eloquently described. I mean, there has to come a time. The problem is, as soon as he won, half of Americans didn't vote for this man, remember that, okay? Half the country, it's totally divided now, America, like we were when Brexit was happening. So it's not true that all Americans are falling over themselves for Trump. So the question is, and I'm not a politician, how far do you placate somebody who, in my view, is irrational, incredibly thin-skinned, and power crazy? How far do we go before we become a colony in virtual colony?
I think the UK, by the way, is, and I give credit to Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the way that he is trying to play this in a calm, measured way, building a bridge not only between ourselves, because they are, whatever we may say, they've always been our best ally for a long, long time, with the European Union as well. And where the European Union is concerned, this is bringing us closer to the European Union as well.
That's good.
And Brexit now, everyone realizes, and I've been doing this for over a year, asking audiences I speak to, how many of you think Brexit was a big mistake and an act of self-harm? I'm not exaggerating, 99% of the hands go up. So this is to our benefit to get closer to Europe.
I'm obviously the one that wouldn't.
But again, we had this debate before. but we've got to be close to both the US and to the EU, and this, in a way, is making that happen.
And also, a thin-skinned, unstable, unpredictable person is somebody, if they're in a position of power, you duplicate them, right? If somebody like that had a gun, I would speak to them with my most inside voice, and I'd try and keep them calm. I don't see why the logic changes if what they've got instead is the entire United States economy
just become a
and military.
subject nation.
No. We already. The thing is, what this is revealing is the extent to which we already have, right? And not just us, most European countries, for the decades since the end of the Cold War, we have had a very enjoyable relationship with the United States where they subsidise the continent's defence. We cut defence to the bone, we plough that money into welfare, and then we look down on Americans for the state of their welfare states, right? And that's been hugely enjoyable for everyone involved, except for the fact that it relied upon America being there and prepared to do all of that, and now it's not. Now, I would be very happy to have a much more independent foreign policy from the United States. But the blunt fact is that would require having our industrial base back, right? It would require having all kinds of strategic resources that we don't currently have, and that takes time to build, right? So if you want to have a more independent policy from the US, that's fine, but you can't do it overnight. And for as long as Trump is in the
country, since we were always told during Brexit that it's the people that matter. Ask the population of Britain if they're prepared to do what you're suggesting.
I think
they will not be prepared.
Then we're going to continue. Well, then we're going to continue being.
Not with you on this.
That doesn't matter. I'm talking about what my position is. And also, if the British public are not prepared to, reindustrialise, to pare back state spending to within our means and so on, then
to kowtow to Trump. The majority of British people are not prepared to do that.
Right, but if he declared a trade war on us, they also wouldn't like the consequences of that, and then they would blame the politicians for all the prices being
He's
higher.
declaring the trade war, we're not.
Not with us.
Well, look, I mean, my constituents don't want to see our Prime Minister in a tit-for-tat spat with the US President. I mean, there's bigger fish to fry on our continent. We've got to protect our Ukrainian friends. It's not time for a PM
and Trump is with Putin. I mean, this is so complicated. We're talking as if we're the elephant in the room. Trump is also encouraging Putin. What are we going to do about that?
We might have a question on that later, so let's leave that one hanging. Text here from Shazad who says, boycott America. I lived in Canada and the UK most of my life and work in finance. This is crazy, and Canada is now thinking of joining the EU. Not quite sure how that would work.
United States,
Israel in the Eurovision Song Contest.
United States, I mean, you might say that, but the United States is our single biggest trading partner as a country by miles. And we have no free trade agreement with the United States of America. We've tried to do it twice in the last 10 years. It's very difficult to do an FTA, free trade agreement with America. But whether we like it or not, it's our biggest trading partner. And we've got a surplus with them, which is good news.
Well, one positive that might come out of this is that the Canadians might want to actually do a free trade with us, because I think over the last few years... Not a proper...
It's been rolled over from the EU.
No, yeah, but it's not... Are you sure about that? Because I don't think Canada has one with the EU.
No, we have one with Canada.
Right, well, I'll bow to your superior knowledge on that, but I thought that the EU hadn't got one with Canada yet. I'm not sure it was a full one, but anyway, we will look that up in the break. We've got more questions to come on all sorts of different subjects, and if you'd like to ask one, the number 0345 6060 973. It's 8:14.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
16 minutes past 8. Yasmin Alibhai-Brown is here, Lord Karan Bilimoria, Luke Charters, Labour MP, and Henry Hill from ConservativeHome. Milo's in Leicester. Hello, Milo.
Good evening. I was just wanting to ask the panel a question of whether they think that Nigel Farage is running reform as his own personal dictatorship.
Yasmin, your good friend Nigel Farage, I'm sure you have views on this.
I don't know enough about the Reform Party, but what one does know, having watched the rise of Nigel Farage, that he is very, now I'm going to have to find the right word, egocentric, narcissistic, but he also does have a way of presenting himself as a man of the people when he's a millionaire, which is in some ways quite admirable. It is extraordinary to see him downing the lager as if he's one of the, the drinkers in the pub. But and he has that thing. You cannot take it away from him. I mean, I loathe the man, but you can't take that away from him. And reform is built around him for that reason, I think.
But do you think in the way that he runs reform, I mean, we've got this spat with Rupert Lowe going on at the moment, we were talking about that in the last hour, do you think that has the potential to bring him down? Because he does have a record of trying to cut down tall poppies who start to rival him in his previous parties.
I mean, from what I've read of Rupert Lowe, is it? Lowe. There's little to choose between them from my political standpoint. So I think this is trouble for the party, and some sorting out will have to be done. I think we need to also remember it's a small party. They've got 4 MPs now, right?
4 million voters.
Yeah, but they've got 4 MPs. Okay, so it's still a small parliamentary party, and
they never show up either. They never seem to show up in the chamber.
And I do think that the bigging up of the party is something quite problematic for me, because we have, I mean, if I was the Lib Dems or the Greens, I would actually want to say, why aren't you talking about us as much as you're talking about this?
Because the Greens have only got 4 MPs as well, and they've got half the number of voters.
But listen, the reason why the Reform Party is doing so well is Nigel Farage, there's no doubt about it. I hadn't even heard of this Rupert guy before. But the other thing is, we in the media, everybody, can't stop talking about this man.
Well, because he gives us things to talk about, unlike rather boring political leaders.
Well, I think, politics is more serious than that. So I hope that this shakes them up. But I don't think Farage will lose very much on this.
OK. Karen?
Well, how things change. It's just a few weeks ago that Reform were heading the polls. If I'm not mistaken, they're even ahead of Labour, let alone the Conservatives. And now you've got this party fighting amongst itself. I say that one thing about Nigel Farage, and he is a phenomenal communicator. He's a phenomenal politician. I give him full marks for perseverance to try to become an MP 8 times and eventually make it. I mean, that takes a lot of perseverance and resilience to do that. But this falling apart with just 5 MPs, from 4 million votes and topping the polls to now, where Reform, you start off as UKIP, then you become the Brexit Party, then you're now Reform. Now what are they going to rename themselves something else? People will stop taking you seriously if this is the way you operate. So formidable politician, great communicator, but this is not the way they're going to go ahead.
Henry, what are ConservativeHome readers saying about this? Because obviously a lot of former Conservatives have gone over to Reform. Do you think this might spark some of them to come back?
I mean, our survey last month showed that this was obviously taken before the low spat, showed that events since the election had made even 2024 Conservative voters, which is, fairly close to the core, you'd hope, of the Conservative vote, more inclined to vote Reform. With Farage and Lowe, this is nothing new. I think if anyone familiar with Nigel Farage's history, Michael Crick did an amazing biography, which I think gives you everything you need to know. He has never, ever been able to let a party outgrow him, right? None of his parties become institutions. And that worked for UKIP, sort of. Obviously, I think, how many leaders did he get rid of after a couple of days? Was it 2 or 3?
It's a few.
Because they were a European Parliament party, no one really paid attention outside of European elections, and then they just went and voted for Nigel, and that's fine. And then they got the European Parliament's glorious expenses account, and that was enough to run the party on and all of that. But the challenge here is there is a potentially the Conservative Party is a moment of historic weakness, right? It's the smallest parliamentary party I think it's had since 1906, and that's in the most marginal parliament since 1945, so a lot of those seats are not very safe. There is a real opportunity here for a challenger party of the right. But if you wanted that to happen, you'd need hundreds of good people. I think this is where it's going to hurt. I don't think in the short term it'll hurt because people will forget. Most voters had probably not heard of Rupert Lowe. But where it is already hurting reform is that the kind of people who they would need to attract as candidates for Parliament, if they really wanted to make a difference, are going to be completely, and already are being completely alienated by this. Because Rupert Lowe, the only Reform MP who really does anything, right? I think I saw somebody saying that with him losing the whip, their combined House of Commons activity since the election has fallen by 46%, right? That's where it's going to hurt, because ultimately it doesn't matter how good Farage is, he's 60, right? I'm sure he can lead them into the next election. He's not going to be leading them into one after that. And if he can't find good candidates, there is no chance of Reform becoming a party that outlives Nigel Farage's active frontline career.
Don't write people off when they're 60, Henry.
I didn't say 60, but can you imagine him leading them into a general election at 70?
I can, actually.
But then Rupert Lowe is
maybe in 1880,
isn't he?
Sorry? Yes. I'm not saying he'll be Prime Minister, but I didn't make the claim that he would be Prime Minister either.
But the interesting thing is, and I don't know if this is true, but from what I've read, is that Rupert Lowe is far to the right of Nigel Farage. Is that right?
I mean, potentially on some issues, or he's just less careful than Nigel Farage, given that he was only elected to Parliament in July and all of that. Yeah. But the thing is, he is. If you're not, you and especially you are not going to agree with Reform's MPs, right? What is a good Reform MP is quite a different question to what is a good Conservative MP or whichever party you support. But if you have Reform's politics, Rupert Lowe is the kind of candidate that you want to attract, in as much as he actually is prepared to do the work. He's got initiative, he self-financed his entire general election campaign and basically got himself elected. That's quite uncommon, and those are the resources that in a small party make a huge difference. And if you're alienating them, that's a problem.
And he's become, I think, quite popular in Great Yarmouth. He donates all of his parliamentary salary to a local charity, a different one each month, which, whatever your political views are, I mean, he can afford to do it. Let's go to Luke Charters.
Well, I mean, at this rate, mathematically, they'll have no MPs left by the next election. I mean, you could fit the 5 of them in a minicab now. It won't be long until you can fit them on a tandem bike. I'm just more gobsmacked from where I sit on the Labour benches to look across and see them vote against things like counter-terror powers to tackle immigration, against measures that would safeguard children that are missing from the educational role. They don't seem to actually have any answers. They don't actually know how to properly operate in the Commons. They don't make meaningful contributions. They miss debates. It's bewildering. They just got no answers. And the more they're under the public lens and those cameras that are all revealing in the House of Commons chamber, the more I think the British people are going to see through them as having no answers.
But in terms of the question, do you think he's running the party as a quasi-dictatorship?
Well, I don't pay too much attention to... it's a shareholder structure, isn't it? It's not the...
No, they've changed it now. They've apparently emulated the Liberal Democrat constitution.
Well, I think if he's lost an MP after 9 months, then, and he's got another MP that's had a conviction in the past, it's not a great record, is it?
So from what you're saying, your experience, they were being accused of being a protest party, and that's all they're doing.
But the other, elephant in the room again, because I've been talking to Reform voters in West London, just to see why.
Really?
Yeah.
In West London? Good
West London. West London.
Imagine they're being in East London.
No, there are quite a lot.
Okay.
And it's quite interesting how many of them say they don't like the fact that there's a Muslim as the chair. They're very open about it. That's not what Reform should be. It's interesting. Sharing information.
Okay. Let's move on to a text question from Sam in Cambridge, who says, actually this is a follow-up question, how much of the reduced support for Nigel Farage is due to his chumminess with Trump? I'm not sure we've seen a lot of evidence of reduced support so far, in that the opinion polls are still showing them sort of mid-20%, sort of competing with the Conservatives and a couple of percent behind Labour. That may change. Let's go to Henry.
Yeah, I think with a lot of this, it takes time for public perceptions of a party to change, because we're all very, very engaged in the day-to-day news cycle, and we see every time Nigel Farage does a bad tweet and all the rest of it, but that doesn't necessarily filter out. I think he got a lucky break with Elon Musk, in that Elon Musk and him fell out just when Elon was properly getting people's attention here in a really toxic way, Farage was given an opportunity to sort of grandstand and distance himself. And he did the same thing at J.D. Vance, when J.D. Vance was like, well, who's come in to help us with all of our wars? And it was, the entirety of Britain was like, well, we did. And he went in on that. I think it is an obvious challenge, because most of the public, as you say, are not MAGA, to put it mildly, right? Donald Trump has a very small fan base in this country, but the organised right, especially to the right of the Conservative Party, is very heavily enmeshed with American
and
right
very
wing.
vocal.
Right. There's lots of them go to CPAC, the big American conference, right? A lot of them hope to get American money, because there is just vast oceans of money in American politics, and even they can probably finance a British operation with money they've got down the back of the sofa. And that, I think, is going to be a very challenging thing, because actually, even if Farage did want to do a really big, hard pivot away from the Republican Party and away from the United States, and even if a lot of his voters would maybe quite like that, the infantry and sort of NCO class of reform, such as it has, a lot of them would not like that at all.
Luke?
Well, if I can share a little secret between friends, I mean, when I've been door knocking in York recently, I'm actually surprised about how much cut through the NHS charging issue has got through to people. I mean, it's a line we've been sharing a lot about Nigel Farage's past comments, but it's things like this that once you keep a message discipline over time, people start to grasp, and once the scrutiny and the spotlight goes to them, I think it's going to unravel.
Who haven't we been to?
Well, Farage loves to put himself forward as a great friend of Trump. And I'm sure there is a friendship there, and Trump seems to like him. And there was even talk, you remember, let's send Nigel Farage as our ambassador. We've got Peter Mandelson there now. But, where's this going to? How effective is this going to be for our country to have Nigel Farage being best friends with Trump? I don't see the benefit to the UK from that at all.
Surely the recipe for his success is if the Tories continue to flounder in the polls, but they maybe have 2 or 3 different leaders before the next election, they just seem to be irrelevant, and if Labour doesn't deliver on its main promises. That is the recipe for success for Nigel Farage, because a lot of voters, understandably, will think, well, the 2 main parties have let us down, let's try something else.
Yeah, but that something else, as we've just heard, is so immature, is so unformed.
No, that's not the way voters think.
But
that's the way we might think in the Westminster bubble.
But
that's not the way people out there think.
voters want to improve their lives. It's not just about, we love Nigel. Nigel's now Prime Minister, we'll wave our flag.
But that's part of the reason the Brexit referendum went the way that it did, because 3 million people decided that they were fed up with politics as it was and came out to vote for the first time, and they voted to leave. And I can see the same sort of thing happening in the next election.
And look where that got us, as we know.
Well,
as we know.
Let's not
but
go
I
there.
think the matter of there's a difference between being a superb campaigner and actually being a serious person in governance, who understands governance. I don't see any evidence that this party understands what it means to govern. And the other thing is the Musk factor. Musk doesn't want him. Musk is now one of the leaders of our country, apparently, because he decides that Low is the one we should...
I'll lay you a bet that between now and a year's time, there'll be the most spectacular falling out between Trump and Musk.
Oh, Lord, yes, please.
And on that note, let's go to the news headlines. It's 8:30 here on LBC. Here's Daryl Jackson.
US President Donald Trump says US officials are heading to Russia right now as pressure piles on the Kremlin to accept an American proposed 30-day ceasefire. Ukraine's already agreed the terms. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has accused the EU of being set up to take advantage of the US, insisting he will retaliate against counter-tariffs. Brussels has announced measures in response to the president's 25% tax on steel and aluminium imports. And a thief's been found guilty of murdering an Amazon delivery driver who'd clung onto the side of his van as it was being stolen. 42-year-old Claudio Carol Condor died in Leeds last August. LBC weather largely cloudy with showers along the North Sea coast tonight, drier in the west and a low of -3.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:32 on LBC. Yasmin Alibhai-Brown is with us, Lord Karan Bilimoria, Luke Charters and Henry Hill. Charlie is in Gaul. What would you like to ask, Charlie?
Does the panel think that the 30-day ceasefire from Ukraine will go ahead?
Well, Donald Trump's team have confirmed that the US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Trump's Middle East envoy Stephen Witkoff will travel to Moscow later this week for negotiations with the Kremlin, warning that Russia would face devastating consequences if it rejects the deal. Luke?
I think we're all hoping for what will be a breakthrough. And we've seen actually an intensification of some of the Russian strikes in recent weeks. Quite a tragic loss of life. Look, I mean, it would give time for Keir Starmer to build that coalition of the willing. I hope we can get those US security guarantees needed to do that. But we've got to have that breakthrough soon enough, because I've been to the Estonian-Russian border just before Christmas. And when you speak to Estonian people there, the threat is very real. And we need our time to build a NATO alliance, to increase our capability and sort out the coalition of the willing.
There's a great thread on Twitter today by Mike Martin, the Liberal Democrat MP for Tunbridge Wells. And he's former in the armed services. And it's headed, "This is how Russia eliminates NATO." And basically it will challenge, or his contention is that it would challenge to America to come to Estonia's defence, and America would say no. That would put Britain in a position of, we have 900 troops, as you will know very well, in Estonia. The French have, I think, 300. And his contention is that if Keir Starmer rang up Donald Trump and said, "Are you going to invoke Article 5 here?" Donald Trump would say no, and we would therefore have to pull our troops out of Estonia. I mean, that would be catastrophic, wouldn't it?
Well, Britain's committed to Estonia, and I've seen...
but on paper, so is America.
And it's exactly right why we've got to step up to the plate in the UK, increase our share of defence spending from 2.5 to 3.0%, and get there as soon as we can. I've also been doing a campaign to break down some of the barriers to investing in defence. There's so much red tape. We've got such innovative SMEs in this country that actually are stuck when it comes to ESG rules, stuck even getting a bank account. We've got to clear up some of that so we can get some of those innovative capabilities out to support our Ukrainian friends.
And de-wokeify pension funds who apparently now won't invest in defence, in arms manufacturers.
The most ethical thing we can do is to support our Ukrainian friends.
Couldn't agree more. Karen?
In 2019, I remember speaking in the debate on the 70th anniversary of NATO. And I was the only peer then who said, we need our defence expenditure to be 3% of GDP, when at that time we were just over 2%. That was 6 years ago. And now we've been struggling to commit. The previous government wouldn't commit to even 2.5%. Now, finally, the Labour government is committing 2.5%. It needs to be 3%. And in this particular environment, it probably needs to be 5%. But I'm saying that's how far ahead. The other thing is, if you just look at the sad situation in Ukraine, the Ukraine war started when I was CBI president. I remember going to meet the Ukrainian ambassador on the Monday following the war. And that's when I heard from the horse's mouth, we are going to fight. Because Putin thought he would walk in the same way that the Taliban took over Afghanistan. When we walked out and the Americans walked out, they just walked in. The Afghan army just disbanded. And he thought the same thing would happen in Ukraine, and there's been a fight. Now, that fight we have supported. The whole of the British public have been behind it. America's been behind it. NATO has been behind supporting Ukraine. But if you frankly look at it, not in a full-hearted way. We don't put troops on the ground because we don't want NATO to engage in a fight with Russia. We don't give weapons which they can use inside Russia. The Ukrainians have been doing this with their hands tied behind their backs. You go back to 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, no one did anything. And then what I've been saying for the last 2 years, and I don't like saying this, but I've seen this coming for the past 2 years. What's going to happen? The attrition that has taken place over the last 2 years, where no one's really made much ground, a little bit of ground taken there. But what's happened? Lives lost. Amputees. Do you know how many amputees there are in Ukraine? There are almost 100 100,000 amputees because of the war in Ukraine. This is sickening. This is sad. So this war of attrition has got nowhere. And what I've seen coming is what's going to be happening is we're going to have a line of control. The Russian-occupied territory, Russia is not going to concede. Ukraine, sadly, is not going to get back. And that line of control is going to be the practical border. Ukraine will never admit that it's given it up to Russia. On their map, they will still show it as part of Ukraine. But in practical terms, that will be the line of control. That will be the practical border that will be policed. And here's the other big mistake.
Which means
Russia.
Putin has won.
Not won, because Putin has also lost. He hasn't been able to take over Ukraine. He's only got 20% of the country. And Ukraine has still got Odessa as a port, by the way, and that's a lifeline for the Ukrainians and for the world in terms of food exports. But here's the big mistake Putin made. Finland and Sweden are now part of NATO. That strengthens and emboldens NATO. The Finland border with Russia is much bigger than the Ukraine border. It's 1,400 kilometers. And you're talking about two formidable military powers. The Finns can mobilize 300,000 trained troops within 3 weeks. And they've fought the Russians before. And if the Russians try and take on the Finns, let alone take on NATO, they've got something coming. So that's been the big mistake where he shot himself in the foot.
Henry?
On the actual question, I suspect he will. I think this is the first time we've seen President Trump actually asking the Russians for something, which is quite nice after dropping bricks on...
What do you think he means by devastating consequences if they don't agree?
Potentially letting America giving Ukraine a lot of very powerful weapons and allowing it to fire them as far into Russia as it likes. I don't think it means troops on the ground, because frankly the US Army War College in 2023 put out a report saying America simply can't do it, right? America, no Western country really has fought a high-intensity conventional conflict against a peer military in decades and decades, and the US Army War College said that America, if they ended up fighting the Russian army on the ground in Ukraine, could expect about 50,000 casualties in 2 weeks. No one in a Western country is prepared for that at all. But I do think that America could give Ukraine an awful lot more kit than it currently has. And this is Trump kind of in Qasem Soleimani mode, right? This is the upside, if you like, to his strategy of being the crazy person that you can't predict, which is that if you're in the Kremlin and you're thinking, right, are we sure he won't do the crazy thing just before we ignore his deadline? Are we sure? Are we really sure he won't do the crazy thing? Because he might. And so I think that Russia will accept it. I do think that this ends with the partition of Ukraine, as you say, because ever since Putin formally annexed, obviously in Russian law, all of the occupied territories into the Russian Federation, it became politically impossible for his regime to give those up. But at the end of the day, unless we were prepared to do what was necessary to let Ukraine pry the Russians out, and I don't think any Western nation has really shown that it is, this is better than simply having hundreds of thousands of young men killed and maimed in a meat grinder where we aren't supporting a victory condition.
Yasmin?
It's so difficult. It's so difficult. There's Russia, Putin and his cabal want to recreate the USSR. It's not going to end. That's his vision. It's been for a long time. He feels the loss, that the whole thing of the end of communism, the breakup of the USSR, was a tragedy, a crime against his people, and so on. So it will not end with Ukraine. It didn't end with Crimea. I don't think one can depend on Trump, whether he's with us or against us. And one of the things that I question then is, if we put up the defence, all the NATO countries put up their defence contribution, I completely understand the points made. People here are already saying, if you talk to them, they're cutting our benefits and they're giving the money there. People think very simply about these things. So to sell it to the British population, any further rise will be difficult, especially as all the cuts are coming down on the people least able to afford it. It's a complicated situation. Putin isn't going to stop while he is still leading Russia. He's just not going to stop.
Completely agree. Right, let's move on to a text question from Stevie in 5. Short answers on this one, please. Is Nicola Sturgeon's legacy the end of any chance of Scottish independence? Now, the former Scottish First Minister and SNP leader announced today that she will not stand for re-election to the Scottish Parliament when its next elections are held in May 2026. She's been an MSP since the Scottish Parliament was first opened in 1999. Henry?
No, I mean, the SNP is still there, the Scottish Parliament is still there, sort of undermining the United Kingdom, as far-sighted people said it would in 1997, but she's made it certainly, she squandered that opportunity potentially that they had after the Brexit referendum, and it will be a lot longer before they get another shot.
Karen?
This whole Scottish independence has been driven by two big personalities. Alex Salmond nearly got there. We forget it was a 55-45 vote. I remember Gordon Brown rushing up there, David Cameron rushing to save the day. And then Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, she she was a dynamo, a formidable politician. Now these two are out of it. I can't see the SNP getting anywhere. And I mean, I'm totally against Scottish independence. It's a part of the United Kingdom, and long may that continue.
Yasmin.
Well, I've completely respected the Scots people who want to be independent, but I do agree that without these two figures, it's not going to come for a long time. And I so admired Nicola Sturgeon in her heyday, but all these sort of awful stuff about her husband and all the businesses within the party, I think destabilized and debilitated her, which is very sad because she was an astute, wonderful politician. And we can't say some countries have the right to declare that they want to be independent, but you can't, Scotland. That's just not right or fair.
But we do that all the time.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean
completely
it doesn't
different
mean it's right and fair. If you're defending the right of some countries...
Should the Serbs of North Kosovo be allowed to secede and join Serbia? Because our official position is no, along with the Western
sometimes
world.
we think it's a wonderful thing for independence for some people. And I think the Scots will come back to it, but they won't, not for a decade, I think.
The majority of people in Scotland want to remain part of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, but things change.
Do you think that she really knew nothing about the stuff that the Operation Branch formed, this massive fraud investigation?
Given that there is a police investigation, should we not go there?
Yeah, fine.
If you don't mind.
I just think she was admirable.
I'll just say, whoever's at the helm of the SNP, the biggest risk is their policy about the nuclear deterrent. And we've just been having the discussion about NATO, about defence on our continent. We've got to maintain a continuous at-sea deterrent. I've been up to Barrow. I've seen the dreadnought.
You've been a lot of places in your short time in Parliament.
I've seen a lot of our defence capability. This is the most important thing. And for the SNP to risk all that at this tumultuous time in our world, I think is really risky.
What about independence for Yorkshire?
I'm a proud Yorkshireman, but not quite.
Cornwall.
You see, we can all come up with little bits of the UK that we'd like to hive off, can't we? Norfolk, no. What about that? No, said nobody ever.
Wouldn't have I don't want to hive any of it off.
Well, I'm sure there are plenty of people that would. There is a Yorkshire party, isn't there?
We can keep Faslane as a sovereign base area.
They come up on the radar.
Right, we've got more questions to come, as well as our fun question at the end of the programme, which Luke Charters is really looking forward to. It's 8:45.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:48. Isabel has WhatsApped in from Poland, who says, some people in Poland listen very carefully to what's going on in Britain. You're the only nation in Europe with cultural ties with us. It's not a question, but I just thought it was an interesting text to read out. Right, here's another question from Wesley in Gravesend. What do you think of Saudi Arabia being given the chair of the UN Women's Rights Commission? Well, Saudi Arabia took over as chair of this commission on the status of women on Monday and will lead the annual Global Summit on Gender Equality when it takes place next Friday. For those of you not watching on Global Player, Yasmin has her head in her hands.
How is this possible? How do we get to this point where money can buy you? Saudi Arabia's got women in prison for driving. At the same time, when he's allowed women to drive, he's stuck a lot of them in prison. The prisons are full of bloggers, of female bloggers. It's a hell on, not as bad as Afghanistan, where they've just buried females before they're dead. How does this happen?
Well, because it's a demonstration of the complete and utter failure and irrelevance of the UN.
No, the UN does some good work, but sometimes, and they do have to ask themselves questions, but it's not just the UN. Saudi Arabia is buying itself prestige in football, in wherever. Money buys them this respect. But when it comes to women's rights, it is a real insult, I think.
I mean, I don't know how you get voted to chair these things, whether it's other countries that vote you in or how it works.
I don't know, but whoever did it, shame on you, really.
Luke Charters.
Just say Saudi Arabia, they've got much further to go on women's rights.
Yeah. They haven't even taken step one.
Karan?
All I can say is I went on a delegation as part of the Great Campaign, the Great Campaign that we have, which is actually a very effective campaign promoting the United Kingdom, to Saudi Arabia last year in May, headed by our former Deputy Prime Minister. And one of the things that was very encouraging from that visit was the huge improvement in women's rights compared with where they were just a few years ago. There is a leap change in it, a long way to go, but compared with the past and the horror stories you hear, the empowerment of women in Saudi Arabia, I think they genuinely want to take it further and further and further. And this is one way of indicating that we're serious about it.
Don't you see what they want you to see?
Yeah,
but
that's
you
exactly right.
also talk to people, and I shared the platform with very impressive Saudi Arabian women leaders of universities. I spoke to them, and that change is happening. And it's happening much quicker than I thought it would happen. And it needs to happen even quicker going forward. And I think if they mean business, they will do it because it's in their own interest to do it.
No, it's not in their own. They're buying it all. They're buying the influence. They're buying the reputation. I'm a Muslim, right? I would never go on pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. While this man, we know what he is. He had a journalist cut up into small pieces. This man is very, very smart. I'll give him that. His father was aging for a long time. He knows what he's doing. And he's, as Iain said, he wants us to see what he wants us to see, and he does that very well. But there are women in that prison, in his prisons, who will never, ever get the rights that they deserve. So I just think it's revolting.
This is just a reminder of what the UN is, right? I think sometimes we imagine the UN to be some kind of nice world parliament or moral authority or, force for any particular thing. It's not. It's fundamentally, it's an organisation that exists. It's a club that consists of the governments, anyone who happens to run a country. Now, that includes good governments, that includes some of the worst regimes on earth, and they're all in there on roughly the same terms, apart from the Security Council. And you get absurdities like this all the time, right? I can remember, I think Iran was elected to the Human Rights Council a few years ago, but that's just what that is just what the United Nations is. It is an amoral forum for conducting global business and trying to, given its post-war origins, trying to prevent war. And that's fine in itself. It undermines itself when it gives itself all of these airs and graces and pretends to be something that it fundamentally isn't and cannot be, and then its actual operation means that it gives the chair of the Women's Committee to
But we've been sucking up to Saudi Arabia too, without proper criticism of what it's done and is doing to its people. You know.
Just a quick word about the UN. I think it desperately needs reform. There's no question about it. But they occasionally do some good things. For example, widows. There's an International Widows Day that was instituted by the UN, and I'm patron of the Lumba Foundation.
Absolutely,
highlighting the plight of widows around the world.
Is that the best you can come up with?
The plight of widows around the world, Ian, it is shocking.
It is shocking.
It is not exactly in the top 50 policy areas that the world should be concerned
hundreds of
with,
millions of people around the world of widows, and they're discriminated upon and treated appallingly, and this is highlighting their plight, and the UN is helping to do that. Now, that's something good that they've done.
That's fine. But if that really is the most important thing that you can come up with as to why the UN is relevant, I'm sorry,
We're talking about women in this question. I'm giving an example where they have done something very good to highlight the plight of some people who are very, very badly treated in many parts.
Why are we focusing on the UN and not Saudi Arabia? Why are we not actually addressing what Saudi Arabia is under this
Well, you have done very eloquently.
No,
but we're going to move on. We're going to move on to another question so we can fit it in before the end. Jay is in Saffron Walden. Jay, hi.
Hi, good evening, Ian. Is it time to ditch Tesla, or every UK Tesla car should have a bumper sticker saying, I bought this before Elon went crazy?
Well, Donald Trump said yesterday that people who vandalise Tesla cars, which is apparently happening in America, I haven't heard it happen here, Tesla cars and dealerships will now be considered domestic terrorists by the US government. The US president also bought a Tesla, which he's named Elon's baby, after the value of Tesla shares fell by 15% on Monday during the widest significant fall of tech stocks in the US. Now, almost 4,000 Teslas were sold in the UK last month. Luke Charters, have you got a Tesla?
Oh no, I don't. I did have a BMW i3. I think electric cars have got a long way to go, but I won't be buying a Tesla.
Yasmin?
No, of course not.
Well, you say that now, but might you have done before his alliance with Trump?
No. I mean, he was always. He's always been monstrous. This man. You know, just because he's the richest man in the world doesn't mean I have to buy his car. No.
Well, you don't have to, but I mean, to be fair to him, which one likes to be from time to time, well, because he built this car brand out of absolutely nothing.
He was a genius then. I grant him that. But what he became
You don't become an ungenius overnight.
Yeah, but he's no longer doing that, is he? He now thinks he's king of the world, together with his orange friend.
Henry.
I mean, I don't really go in for boycotts in general. I also think one of his companies, SpaceX, is still doing really, really fantastic work. And it's really frustrating that he's decided to become the world's most divorced man and buy Twitter and go crazy when he's already reduced Earth to orbit by a factor of 10. But I wouldn't buy a Tesla just because he won't make bikes. And I would love an electric vehicle, but I am waiting for the sort of the age of the electric motorbike when they're fast and quiet. That will be really nice.
Karen.
Tesla has led the electric car revolution. There's no question. You can't take that away from them. The reality is we as a country have got a long way to go in terms of the infrastructure for electric cars to really rocket in this country. But the biggest threat to Tesla is actually China. The Chinese electric cars are now taking over the world. They're much cheaper. People say they're as good or better. And Tesla can't compete with that. And I'm seeing that in parts of the world where you see more and more Chinese electric cars.
I remember when I was on holiday in Spain last year, I had a car and I got given this one brand that I'd never heard of. I started driving. It was an electric car. I thought, this is fantastic. And it was a Chinese one. But they're apparently not on sale in this country. Bizarrely, I don't know why that is. Right, let's move on to our fun question. Paulie in Hull says, the country group Remember Monday, who are representing Britain at the Eurovision Song Contest this year, say that they're already nervous ahead of the big night in Basel in May. What's your all-time favourite Eurovision moment, whether it's a famous act you've loved or a fancy dress party that you've been to? I'm rather dreading the answers on this. Henry, let's start with you.
I mean, I have been to a lot of Eurovision parties, but I think in the spirit of them, I can't remember them.
You have to be drunk to go to them.
Yeah, they were all... No, I got there. But there's a sort of haze between which I changed from about 20 to about 28, and all the parties merged together. But for me, it's the commentary. Just that really dry, especially Terry Wogan's commentary. There was a wonder. The one that's sleeping out is when I think Andorra voted against France or something, and he just went, "Well, that's the end of Andorra then." And I was like, "That's what I'm watching this for."
Karen.
Apart from Null Point, I think the biggest impact Eurovision has had is ABBA. I mean, that when they won, and yes, 50 years later, they are still timeless.
Well, I can remember watching that as a 12-year-old.
And that we have to thank Eurovision for ABBA, who've been brilliant.
We absolutely do. Yasmin?
I've never watched any of it.
Shame on you.
But yes, I know of it, but I do remember the woman with the beard.
Dana International.
She was
Israeli
rather lovely.
entry. I was the first. I actually went to that Eurovision because Graham Brady, who was then the youngest MP, got invited and he didn't want to go, so he gave me his ticket, courtesy of the BBC. And I don't know why, I was in the hotel where she went back to, and then she comes through the door, and I think I was the first person to kiss her.
Oh,
or
Iain.
is it him? I don't know how we refer to Dana International.
I think it's a she.
Yeah, okay. Luke?
Well, last year was one that went dig, 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 and my little boy loves his sandpit and diggers and digging in the sand, and he kept singing all of that. Maybe one of the listeners can let me know which country did the dig,
Do you
dig,
not
dig
mean
song.
Diggy Lou, Diggy Lay, Swedish winner in, I can't remember the year.
Well, this was last year.
Oh, was it last year? Okay, well, you need to play your son that one. Get it up on Spotify. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for coming in today. On Monday's panel, we have the Labour MP and Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Dame Emily Thornberry and the assisted dying campaigner Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain, plus 2 anonymous people that I don't know the identity of at the moment. Now, coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk to Katie Amos. Katie's been on the programme several times over the past few months. She's been conducting a campaign to persuade the government to conduct a full public inquiry into the terrorist murder of her father, Sir David Amos. Now, she has been to see the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, today. He was asked about this in Prime Minister's questions by Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative MP, Andrew Rossendale. So she'll tell us what happened at this meeting with the Prime Minister this afternoon and about the campaign more widely and the effect that it's had on her and her family. And she's happy to take your calls as well. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock.